I still feel weird sometimes saying that I'm impatient. There's a negative connotation to it. But the truth is, it's one of the things that I think, if I look back, has been most directly correlated with my success.
Hi, I'm Sally Christensen, the founder and CEO of Argent, a women's workwear brand. And this is Work Friends, a podcast for those who take their work, but not always themselves, seriously. Work Friends. My next guest is someone who I've admired for years. Anjali Sud is the CEO of Tubi, the free streaming platform that houses the world's largest library of movies and TV series. She's been at the helm for the past year, and during that time, the platform has already hit a record number of viewers. But Tubi is not Anjali's first rodeo as far as CEO tenures go. She stepped into the role for the first time several years ago at Vimeo when she was just 33 years old and successfully transformed the business, turning it from a video streaming site into a software company. I have loved following her career and even more so learning about her incredibly inspiring story that's brought her here. From her upbringing in Flint, Michigan to Harvard Business School to quite a few odd jobs, they've all shaped her as a leader who's unapologetic about her ambition and showing up to work exactly as her full self. I'm excited for you to get to know Anjali Sud. Hi, Anjali.
Hi, Sally.
Thank you for being here. I want to start actually by sharing the story that you inspired the Work Friends series.
That's crazy.
So Argent launched in 2016. And I remember that you were immediately on my radar because you were one of our earliest customers and you wore our boucle blazer.
Yes. I am an OG fan. I think it was 2017 that I think I bought your blazer. I was 33. I had just become CEO of Vimeo. It was a complete surprise. I had no idea what I was doing. And I had my first public appearance. I think it was a Yahoo Finance interview.
Yes.
And I was like, what does a CEO wear? And I think I went onto Google and just searched like CEO women's blazer or something. And your site popped up. And I didn't know anything about it. And so I looked at it, and I think at the time that boucle blazer had the inner pocket where your like lipstick or phone could be. And I just was like, that's awesome. Finally, like somebody's thinking about women and how they design workwear. So I bought it. I wore it. It gave me tons of confidence that I really needed. And then I was a fan ever since.
It's so funny because I was on the other side. I think someone sent it to me. I think a number of people sent it to me and they're like, she's amazing. And I think she's wearing your blazer. And then I knew starting Argent that we wanted to pull real women and professional women into our storytelling, but we weren't able to do it immediately because you're just so resource constrained. And so when you wore it, I knew that whenever we launched what eventually was named Work Friends, that we wanted you involved. So this is a very real full circle moment.
Well, I have to tell you, I have obviously been a fan just very organically and followed the brand. And it's awesome to see you as an entrepreneur build how much you've built it over 7+ years.
Thanks.
Like, I think I saw it was like Hillary Clinton wearing your stuff this week. And I'm like, what's going on? This is fantastic. So congrats to you.
Thank you. Because of people like you. Okay, so we'll start with just an icebreaker. I am curious to hear your professional pet peeve. I can start with mine.
Okay.
So I really would love for people to come with solutions, but I feel like oftentimes people come with problems. That would be a pet peeve of mine when people just present the problem without any sort of path to resolution.
You are speaking my language. Yes. I have a sweater that I sometimes wear that says both can be true. And it's sort of the idea is like, instead of thinking of things as an or, thinking of things as an and, as a way to force creative solutions. So I hear you. I guess here's a pet peeve. It's kind of maybe controversial. I don't love when we talk about the goal of meetings and gatherings as alignment. So the term alignment is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. And people say it all the time, but I don't love it because I feel like ultimately your job is you want to make the best decision, right? You want to like seek the truth and get to the right outcome. And I always think like, is our goal really to meet and just align? Or is that just going to be like compromising so that everyone, kind of feels like they were right? Every time I hear the word alignment, I'm like, that's not the goal. We actually want to passionately, vigorously debate. And it's okay as long as we ultimately get to the right decision and disagree and commit. So that's probably one of mine when people say alignment.
That's great. Okay, now to start early days, Anjali. I would love to hear about just what growing up in Flint, Michigan was like, and maybe some early examples of work that started to spark your ambition.
Yeah, so I'm the oldest of three. My parents are immigrants from India. I was born in Detroit, and we moved to Flint when I was 2. My parents are still there today. It's my hometown. I go all the time. It was really interesting growing up in like a very, sort of probably traditional immigrant family. We had no other relatives around. My parents had left everyone that they knew to come to the U.S., sort of pursue their American dream. But we had this community of other immigrants in, sort of our neighborhood. And so I feel like I grew up in I always felt like I was like American and Indian the whole time. Probably the things that shaped me the most growing up and like made me super ambitious, and I think unapologetically so, is one, yeah, like my parents, they had sacrificed a lot to come to America, and I did feel like I was being given an opportunity and I had to do something with it, right? And I wanted to, sort of pursue the world and have big dreams and sort of strive towards them, because that was literally like since the time I could remember the ethos of the environment I grew up in. And then I think the other piece of it was growing up in Flint. This was at a time where the auto industry had left Flint, and there was huge economic impact in my hometown. And we saw it in education, you saw it in the economy, you saw it in healthcare. And then obviously later we found out that you saw it in drinking water. And I think that for me was just a very stark recognition of how business impacts community and impacts lives. I think probably when I was, probably 10, 12 years old is when I really started to kind of connect the dots between like pursuing ambition and the American dream and doing something with, the sacrifices my parents had made, with actually sort of believing that at scale, businesses can really impact livelihoods and communities in a really long-lasting way. So yeah, I'd say pretty early on, I was excited about being in business, though I didn't actually know what that meant. I had absolutely no idea what I would do. I never was like, I will hopefully one day be the CEO of a video platform. Like that never occurred to me at that age, but I did appreciate that as something to aspire towards.
We're very similar. I grew up on a farm in Hardyville, South Carolina with an immigrant father from Turkey. Spent my summers in Turkey, but he's an entrepreneur. So I think from early days, I just wanted to be in business, but didn't know what that looked like, which is really our goal in like putting people like you in front of a camera and showing you what business looks like. Because I didn't grow up with that modeling. And so our goal really is to like pull that modeling in. But I think you were similarly influenced by your father, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. My father was not subtle, to be clear. Like I would literally come home from school and there would be Wall Street Journal clippings on my bed about like some leader, who was but it came from a very genuine place. I think, it was always genuinely about business creates jobs, and jobs create opportunity, and opportunity creates impact. And that's infectious, when you're young and, but yeah, it was always very much, my dad really believes still to this day that business can have just such a massive positive impact on society.
Yeah. Aligned. And you're living that. So your path to CEO was not direct. So I want to talk about that a little bit, because you wanted to be, and you've been pretty open about this, an investment banker. And at one point you were a toy buyer and then diapers. And so I actually think nonlinear paths are what keep us like the most innovative, and that's proven through data. But talk to me about how you landed, like how you set your sights, I think, on investment banking. And then
yeah, well, I think hopefully most young people will appreciate knowing that I had absolutely no idea how to get where I wanted to be or what I wanted to even be. And your career is, so much of it is a journey of self-awareness. For me, the reason I wanted to be an investment banker was mostly because I was in a undergraduate program where that's what everyone said I should do. And so I was like, oh, I should do that.
Who's saying that? teachers,
I
peers?
think it was more, so I went to Wharton for undergrad, the Wharton School, which is a business program. And so it was more like the smartest kids all went into investment banking or consulting, right? And if you got good grades, like that was the job you did. And this was at a time, in fairness, where in general, those were high-paying jobs. Yeah. And so, of course, people heard, oh, Goldman Sachs, your parents would be proud. It was all the sort of wrong reasons to want to do something. Yeah. But yes, I was young, and that's kind of what drove me at the time. And in my case, I perhaps they noticed this in the interviews. I don't know, but I struggled to get a job in investment banking. I was rejected from all the big banks and ended up like at the very last minute before graduation. There was like a startup investment bank that had just literally was opening and was looking for their first analyst. And so I was so committed to trying to get into investment banking that I was like, I'll do this job. And it's one of those things where I look back now and it was a great decision. It was a great decision because, one, being in investment banking was uncomfortable for me. It wasn't easy. And it forced me to become super financially fluent and confident in areas that ultimately, 15 years later, when you're running a public company, become extremely important when you're talking to investors. And that's the language you have to speak. So that turned out to be really great. And then, ironically, I think not being at this brand name, big company, it put me on a path to do things very differently than I would have expected that ultimately led me, I think, to where I got to, which was probably far surpassed my own sort of what I imagined was possible for myself.
You touched on something that I think is really important to talk about is how impressionable we are when we're growing up by our peer groups, by our teachers. I mean, I grew up in the South and remember internalizing the message that girls are worse at math, which is just fundamentally untrue. And I'm great at math, but there are these things that just sort of set us on a path, I think that's why it's so important that we're having these conversations and trying to connect with that demographic, because girls really are the future and have so many superpowers.
I totally agree. It's funny. I think there's so many lessons I think back to that time. And I'm optimistic about how far we've come on that front. But like I remember, I think I was one of very few women in this investment bank. And I was super conscious of it. And I was super aware of the fact that I needed to contort how I dressed and how I spoke and how I showed up in a room so that I could somehow come across more like the 60-year-old white men that were the partners, which of course I would never actually authentically be able to do. And I mean, I remember like the way I wore my hair, the clothes that I wore, constantly feeling like I had to fight my natural communication style. I think that does such a disservice to the fact that we're each unique, and the thing that matters the most for business success is being passionate and authentic and you. That definitely was a period of my life where I look back and I feel so freed from it now. And I hope many more people can start their careers with that freedom because it's so amazing.
I had a similar experience. My first job was in banking. And pretty much everything except overtly speaking the words, you don't qualify for these jobs because you're a woman, was done, So it was very clear to me which jobs I wasn't even allowed to consider. And it was a 60 white male traditional bank. And I think that does still happen, but I'm with you. I'm hopeful because I think that we're talking about it more. And I don't think we can talk about it enough until we see real change and progress. I'm curious to know if you were ever given a reason as to why you were rejected from all of these investment banks. And I think what you touched on without saying it is that, and this is something that I have, and I think it's a result of having an immigrant as a father, but I just moved through the world with a bit of a chip on my shoulder, it's from, I think, all the misogyny as well that I grew up around. And it's not my parents. My parents are incredible and so progressive. And I think that's why I am who I am. But I do think that underdog mentality just shapes who we are.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like the more I got rejected, the more I was like, I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
Right? Like I will be an investment banker, even if I'm not entirely sure why. I will do this because people are saying that I'm not good enough. And I like that was a huge motivator. But it's interesting, like candidly, I think the reason I, in many cases, didn't, get the jobs that I wanted, some of it was legit. Like I don't think I did as well in the interviews as some of my peers. I also think some of that was because I was intimidated. There are technical interviews and even things like when I was at Wharton, there weren't as many women. And, you get these study groups together. And, I didn't even realize that I had peers who were like the benefits that they got from being in a study group together. And I'm like sitting there on my own, just like, oh, I'll just study and do okay. And like there were so many things that I realize now that kind of I just wasn't showing up as the most advantaged. So that was part of it. And I own that. I'm like, oh, I should have realized that. I wish someone had like taught me that or I had seen it. The other thing that happened, and this was probably the moment where I felt the most convicted that I was going to do investment banking was, I won't say the name of the bank, but one of the banks did in an interview say to me, we just don't think you have the personality to be an investment banker. And, I do come across I probably don't sound when I'm excited and talking about things maybe like a traditional investment banker might, and that pissed me off.
Yeah, rightfully.
And that was when I was like, that's ridiculous. There shouldn't be a personality for an investment banker. There should just be a good investment banker. And I think so. Yes, absolutely. I think the way I showed up in interviews impacted opportunities. But yeah, it just motivated me.
Yeah. I mean, look at you now. So you've touched on it already, but you have been very outspoken about being vulnerable, ambitious, and impatient, which I think is great and sets the right model. But can you share a bit more about what that means to you? And have you always felt empowered by these qualities, or do you appreciate them more in hindsight?
Impatience has been one that it's taken me time to fully embrace. It is true. I have always been impatient about my career, and I've always just wanted to keep my learning curve steep. So if I was in a job and I felt like, I had not mastered it, but I learned sort of 80% of what I was going to learn, I always wanted to move to the next thing. And you can imagine there are times in your career where that isn't, what the company that you're at is looking for. And I did have times in my career where that was a friction point where I would say like, I want to go do something else, or I want to take on more. And sort of the business need wasn't there, or there was a perspective or an ethos at that company or at one company where it was like, you have to be in a role for 3 years before you can do something else. And I just was so impatient, and that really just didn't comport with what I was looking for in my career. And now I look back and I'm so glad I was impatient. And it's okay. Sometimes what you want in your career doesn't match to what a business's needs are. It's not that the business is bad or wrong or holding you down. It's just there's a mismatch. And I think one thing that I did well is when that occurred, I moved. I just, I just said, you know what? I get it. I'm going to go find something else. And that did allow me, I think in my 20s, to probably get a pretty diverse set of experiences that ultimately ended up helping me a lot. So that, I think, was one. And I still feel weird sometimes saying that I'm impatient. There's a negative connotation to it. But the truth is, it's one of the things that I think, if I look back, has been most directly correlated with my success.
Yeah, I think pros and cons. For me, I think early career, if I'm looking at who I'm hiring now, there is a level of impatience around things like promotions, et cetera, that I think are sometimes not warranted. I share that quality, and now I see it as a huge strength because I'm demanding results with some immediacy, but you do have to temper it too, right?
And I think like for me, the way I've sort of thought about it is like, and whenever people ask me for career advice too, it's like the magic happens when your career and personal career ambitions match to how you can help a business succeed. That's when impatience is magical, right? Because now I want to do more and in service of making the business better, and that actually accelerates the business. Those are the instances where you should lean in and great things can happen. I think to your point, when it's sort of like a personal ambition that doesn't match with what the business needs, that's a hard environment to live in. And either you have to adapt or you probably need to find another environment, and that's okay. And then on vulnerability, that one is one where I feel like every day still, I am learning to embrace and turn into an empowering thing. I definitely think as a leader, I've seen the benefits of being vulnerable. And I think for me, probably the biggest realization I've had in recent years is when you do achieve success and you are a woman and you look different, there's a tendency to put the pressure on yourself that you need to always show up as like wildly successful. Especially women. Like I think we want to be perfect. We want to be, and part of it is like for ourselves, and part of it is because we know representation matters. And we want everyone, we want to show everybody like this is what success looks like. Like, look how great I am. I can do it, so can you. And I think for me, what's happened in the last few years is I've gone through ups and downs. I've had the highest highs, and I've also failed publicly. And that is what surprises me the most from that experience is what I've found is that actually showing that you can be perfect and great and you can be imperfect and flawed is actually really important for young people to see as representation because it makes it much more accessible. And so I've really started to just embrace not just vulnerability, but just like striving very openly and being kind of fearless about anything and everything that can come from that. Because for me, that sort of feels like true power.
And I think that's being human is having highs and having lows. Like we all are riding this roller coaster of emotions. We have good days, we have bad days, and we all fail at different levels. The best leaders are absolutely the ones that are willing to own that and speak to that. But I think we also have to allow for women to fail more because I do think that there's a lot of power in that for future generations as well. And that's also how we innovate and we break things and we make them better. So you have been a CEO twice now, which is remarkable. First Vimeo, now Tubi. So many people, I think, dream of having that title. Oftentimes, people tell me they want to be an entrepreneur and it looks so glamorous. The CEO title, I think, is similar. Tell us what it was like to get there. Because you mentioned that it was a surprise to you. So I do want to hear that story. What myths do you want to dispel about the role? But also, what are the hard parts?
I think by the time I was in my early 30s, I wanted to be a CEO. I just thought that was something that like I'd work my way up the ladder and might happen when I'm like 60. And I just found myself in kind of the right environment at the right time where I joined Vimeo right at the moment where the company was going through a little bit of like a sort of strategy reset. And there were a lot of questions and a lot of gaps that weren't being filled at the company. And it just was one of those where I got really excited and passionate about championing one strategy and was sort of willing to step up and fill the gap of kind of being the person to say, I'll bet my job on this.
Yeah.
And more because I had nothing else to lose, frankly. And I genuinely was excited about it. And then that just sort of evolved through a series of very serendipitous moments where ultimately it became the thing that the investors and board kind of said, okay, this is the right strategy. And I was really fortunate that Barry Diller, who at the time owned Vimeo, he's a guy who likes to bet on people and give them opportunities. And so they just said, listen, she's been championing this. Let's give this 33-year-old with no experience running a company an opportunity to run a global video platform. And, and so I found myself, in a matter of, a 24-hour period, kind of suddenly stepping into this job. It was incredible experience. I will look back and say, for me, the thing that made it incredible and possible was actually the relationships that I had built with the people around me at the company, both my peers and below. It was having that group rally around me that really made it possible for me to just step in and kind of become the leader I wanted to be. And it's why I look back and I think this all the time, just relationships are so important. Being generous with credit, helping people out, making sure that it's not about you looking good, it's about the team. Those were the principles. I think I didn't even realize I was building those, but those were the things that carried me during that time. Myths of being a CEO or a leader, I mean, it's obviously never as glamorous as it might seem. It's a lot of pressure and responsibility. I think the two things that I didn't realize that probably have forced me to evolve the most. One is and people say this, it's a very lonely job. And, I loved being part of the team. I loved feeling like we were equals on a playing field. And ultimately, when you become the boss, you don't get the luxury of doing that. And part of your job is to make hard decisions that no one else should be making, that no one else can make. And part of your job is to be comfortable not being popular and not being well-liked all the time. And that was probably one of the hardest transitions. The other one is recognizing that when you become the boss, you lose some of the honesty and openness that you once enjoyed with your team. There's a power dynamic there. And you can be the most accessible, friendly, team-oriented leader in the world, but people will filter a little bit what they say to you because you are their boss and you determine their job and their compensation and their career path. And you have to, for a while, I wanted to ignore that power dynamic and just pretend it didn't exist, but it very much does. And that has led me over the years to really embrace this idea of very explicitly trying to surround myself with people on my executive team who are just, I like to say, I like to hire people who don't need the job and who don't think of themselves as an employee, partly because they're more likely to tell me what they think, to disagree with me, to call out my bullshit, to pull me aside and be like, you screwed that up. And I have just found that to be such a better way to operate and be successful. So I find that I have to combat that all the time. And if I don't create an environment where people feel super comfortable, then just the natural inertia is that you're not going to get – it's very hard to actually have a pulse on what's happening because people just – they naturally filter.
Sometimes I'll hear women the question I often get asked is how do you do it with 2 children and be in this role? And that's also the myth I wanted to spell. I think that getting to the CEO role is actually the best thing you can do because then you own your own schedule, you have more flexibility, you have the experience from which to set policies and to, establish a different way of operating and culture. And so I think that actually having a CEO title for me has been a gift from a parenting perspective in a lot of ways.
I built incredible empathy and a sense I appreciate the privilege of being the boss. And I can tell you, if you ask the teams who had worked with me before I had kids, I was definitely that tone deaf leader that was let's do the meeting at 6 o'clock. I'm let's just get on the call at 6 o'clock, not realizing that's the window and people get to see their kids. And I really feel going through the experience of becoming a mother and right now my life is complete chaos at home. It's the classic stuff. And I think it makes me so much more empathetic to the needs of others on my team. And I agree with you. People always ask how you do it. And I always say it's so much easier for me than most of the people that work with me because I do have that privilege of having more control and often more resources. I absolutely, even with all of that, can barely keep it together. So I just can't, I have so much empathy for what it's like. And I think there's a ton we have to do, particularly in the United States, to really kind of create the right institutional support for mothers. I think there's an extremely compelling economic argument to do so.
Yeah, I think federal paid leave and just knowing how great economically it is to have women stay engaged in the workplace. And we have to make these really binary decisions of yes or no, do I opt in or opt out completely? And similarly, I entered the workplace and was I'm here at 7. Why are people rolling in at 9, And now it's hard to get out of the house by 9. You're just balancing so much in the morning. And it's something we don't talk about enough because it's a struggle for all of us and kids. No matter how much infrastructure you have around it and how much care you have, it's still hard on the parents because there are just too many demands,
And I think, there's also this, you have to recognize that we all are showing up to work with all of those stresses and just give people grace more to be I've found more and more recently, there, you can kind of normalize and create a culture where people are just more comfortable being I'm sorry, I just had this completely crazy morning. I'm barely able to focus. Just give me a minute and kind of just create a little bit more of the openness. The other thing that I think is really interesting is it's not just things like support for mothers. It's also just recognizing that there's a lot of partners that also, I think more and more, if we create the support and we destigmatize things like, parental leave and all of these things, there's also ways that you can create more support structures. So it's not also all on the mother to both be great at work and at home.
Dave, my husband, takes a lot of the parenting roles, and I observed that there would be like chats to find nannies, and he signed up as himself and had to immediately change it to my name because there's this reverse challenge that we have where dads sometimes are disadvantaged when it comes to trying to take the lead in some of these
Absolutely.
situations.
And it's funny, I never give my husband enough credit because like, which is probably, it's a major factor when you ask like, well, how can you do all these things? It's also because I have a partner who is able to take more than 50% of that load. And there's no question that is essential and critical to everything I've been able to do.
And they'll like this part of the conversation. I am just curious if you put your name in the hat for CEO at Vimeo, or did that job come to you without you having done that?
I didn't put my name in the hat. So the background is I had been at Vimeo running marketing and our CEO left. So our investors were looking for a new CEO. I did not put my hat in the ring, nor should I. Like I wasn't even remotely like kind of in the consideration set. And so what happened is that there was a full year where there was a search for a CEO. And that was to run Vimeo we were actually going to invest in original content and go and be sort of in the streaming space. And I had no experience in that, and that wasn't what I knew, and I actually didn't believe in that strategy for Vimeo. So what I had sort of done instead was they'd given me a small team, almost like an incubator within Vimeo to go and do something totally different on the side while the rest of the company focused on this new big strategy. So I was kind of doing my thing on the side because I just believed it was a better strategy. And again, kudos to our board. They were kind of like, yeah, like, well, I don't know if that's a thing, but let's just let her kind of with a small team see what happens. Like, who knows? Almost like a hedge. It was a hedge. And then what ultimately happened is after about a year of looking for sort of an external CEO and pursuing this strategy, it just sort of became clear that Netflix and others were going to do that strategy better. And I think I had sort of inadvertently we'd been championing this other path, and it was working, and it was actually scaling and doing really well. And so, no, I didn't put my hat in for CEO, but I definitely made it clear whenever I had an opportunity that I believed that the strategy that my team was leading was the right one, that we were winning and it was working, that we should have more resources, and that we had a vision and a plan. And like, if somebody wanted to give us more, of the company's attention to do it, we were ready to go. So to me, it was a complete surprise. But if you sort of look back, well, yeah, kind of you could see how I was positioning myself that way. At the time, it didn't even occur to me because it was so preposterous that in my mind that could be a possibility.
It's incredible. It's a great example of betting on yourself, and hats off to Barry Diller too.
It takes a lot. It takes a lot of guts to put someone like me in that position, and of course he can do whatever he wants. So that's what he did. But yeah, it is, and it's why I'm such a believer in when people are. I think it's so important to be ambitious about your career.
Yeah.
But it's why I'm such a believer in always tying that ambition to what's good for a business. It's not because I'm like morally or philosophically like that's great. It is, but it's because that is my lived experience. It's that by finding a way to make the business successful, that's what unlocked these incredible opportunities I never would have considered.
So you led Vimeo through an IPO, and I would love to hear about the challenges, the stresses of that, and how do you navigate that as a leader? Where does gut come into play versus data? Talk us through anything about just going from stepping into a CEO role for the first time to fast forward, you're IPOing a company. What, 4 years later, maybe?
Yeah. It was about 3 years later. It was so interesting looking back. I think, obviously, when I became the CEO of Vimeo, my job was to grow and scale the company. And we were sort of doing that pretty steadily. And then the pandemic happened, and we were one of those sort of pandemic beneficiaries. So when everybody else was worried about the livelihood of their business being shut down, if you were a restaurant, in Vimeo's case, overnight, the usage shot up. So we were really stressed, but it's because we had to suddenly have our technology scale to support way, way more usage. It's like every, town hall had to be live streamed for the first time, and people were using our technology to do it. Video was becoming a critical way to communicate. And so it was stressful, but it was this heady, exciting kind of stress. And we kind of went through that and ultimately went public really right at the height of that sort of demand spike. And so it was, on one hand, an exhilarating, thrilling experience. And I completely understand why people celebrate going public. And, for me, ringing the bell on the NASDAQ, that was a wonderful career moment and a wonderful moment for the team who had worked so hard. And then you wake up the next day and you've got a business to run and you're doing it on the public markets, which means that every second there's a stock price that's effectively grading and evaluating how you're doing. And the truth is, like, that was very hard, especially for us, because we were sort of public and born. Our first year or two as a public company was at a time of extreme volatility and a lot of pressure on the stock and just a lot of pressure on the business overall. So it was not fun, certainly. Interestingly for me, I think you learn a lot and develop a lot when things are hard. It's a grueling experience, but it also sometimes it just brings out the grittiest, most resilient part of your team. And I think it helps kind of in many ways bring a certain group of people together. That was actually, for me, like, I look back and it was hard, but it was actually manageable because we had that. We had those people who were like fighters and who were like, it doesn't, like, let's go. We're here to just keep doing what we're doing. And I think that was incredible. And then I think the biggest thing you learn is just that, short-term versus long-term when you're building something that you believe in. If anything, I look back at the experience and I feel grateful that I got to learn and develop the sort of muscles to kind of ignore the noise a little bit. And you have to be really rigorous on the public market. So I think about it as like it made the business stronger. It forced us to get to profitability and be self-funding faster. And now I can look at what we did and say, like, Vimeo can be around for the next 50, 100 years and never have to raise another dollar. And it was really, really painful to get there and not fun. But boy, did we learn a lot and did we build a stronger business? So I look back and I would say great learning experience. It doesn't kill you, makes you stronger. But also companies should not aspire to go public just because it sounds like a romantic, fun thing to do. It's a very serious decision that you have to be ready for.
And who are you turning to in the moments of, like, we've gone public and this is incredibly hard and I'm flying blind a little bit. This is all new to me. Who are you turning to in this moment?
For me, it was sort of two groups. One, my team. And I don't mean like my board or investors. I mean like the team around me that I had built. They were my source of strength. And there were times when I had peers who held me up, and there were times when I held somebody up, and and that was awesome. And I'm, again, so grateful for having that experience. And then on the other, it was my family. I used to call my dad all the time, and he'd send me, one of those texts, or my mom would she'd ship me a mug that, with like an inspirational, like, you got this, girl, and that was wonderful. And that's where, I think, again, the hardest times you turn to the people who know you best and who've got your back. Even my girlfriends, my high school girlfriends were like there for me when I was, I'd had a rough week and I just needed, I needed to just kind of vent. So yeah, it's the people that you love. And that's always the case, probably no matter what job you're in.
And then Tubi came knocking, or you went knocking.
Tubi came knocking. Initially I was like, no, probably not the right thing. For all, it was sort of same conversation you have all the time. And to this day, it sort of surprises me that I made that change. But I genuinely got excited about the entertainment industry and Hollywood and some of the changes that I think are happening right now. And I just developed a conviction that ultimately surprised me. But as I learned more about the business and the industry, I just developed a conviction that the future of entertainment is going to be reshaped, and it's going to happen now over the next few years. And I think it's an industry that needs different kinds of leaders and different perspectives. And so it was for those reasons. I said this to the Tubi team when I started, but this wasn't something where I felt like I needed to do another CEO job, frankly. I probably should have taken some time off and but I genuinely I took this job because I believe we can help define the future of entertainment. And I think we can, and I think stories matter. I think it shapes culture and understanding. And that's why I took the job. And it's been really wonderful so far. We've got plenty to do, but so far it really feels like that opportunity is still very much intact.
I've just decided I want to work for you in this conversation is what I've decided. It's incredible. Okay, so I'm curious to hear what onboarding as a CEO is like, actually.
So onboarding, so Tubi was led by an incredible founder for over 10 years. And he was the one who stepped aside, and that's why I ended up taking the role. And so it's really interesting when you take on a CEO job as sort of from the outside in as an operator when it's been founder-led. I think it's really interesting because you have a leader who has set a vision for the company and believes in it with every fiber of their being and fought for it every day for a decade to make it happen. And in Tubi's case, like the model of being free in streaming was for a very long time considered not possible. And it was the founder, Farhad, who really just unwaveringly, despite lots of reasons and lots of signals that would say it wasn't going to work, persisted. And so I think initially coming in as a CEO, you have to start with just a deep respect and appreciation for what has been built. And I honestly was like, part of my job is don't fuck it up, right? Like take the strengths and pour fuel on them and accelerate what's working. And don't make that cardinal mistake that can sometimes be made where somebody feels like you come in new leader, you have to make your mark, you have to change a bunch of things. So that was kind of one thing I was very acutely aware of. And usually with these transitions, there's no overlap. A leader leaves and a new leader comes in, and then it's yours from the minute that you take that job. And that's usually how it's that way for a reason. And so I think for me, the biggest thing in my onboarding was listening to the team, having tons of questions. I always say like nothing is sacred, right? One of the things I can bring is I have a fresh perspective. So I get to question every single things that had previously been assumed as sacred. I should question those things. But almost doing that behind the scenes and resisting the temptation to change things or problem solve or apply a lesson that worked at Vimeo to Tubi because they're totally different businesses. So for me, the onboarding was my first 90 days. It was so much of it was like listen, learn, be sort of insatiably curious, note all of the things that seem like, hold on, wait a minute, maybe there's a way to do this differently or better, but resist the temptation to make a bunch of changes. And so that was the onboarding experience. And I think largely, I do feel like it was the right thing to do. And even now, I'm almost a year in, and there's still so much institutional knowledge and so much around the culture that I'm continuing to absorb.
You're scaling quickly. So as you scale, how do you balance nurturing existing talent, that institutional knowledge, with attracting new talent? And what are you looking for in people that you're hiring?
So Tubi's been really fortunate in that we are scaling really quickly. And, we're now the most watched free movie and TV streaming service in the US and Canada. And just generally what we're seeing is, particularly among younger audiences and Gen Z audiences, just, real frustration and kind of a lack of patience with a fragmented set of, platforms where we have to pay a lot of money and people are raising prices. And there's a lot of decisions being made in the industry right now that are being made because P&Ls have to get to profitability versus what makes sense for viewers and audiences. And we're sort of benefiting from that. So it's been a lot of sort of rapid scale. And I think as I think about talent in the team, there's a couple things. One, actually, it's actually slowing down our hiring a little bit. We continue to grow, but I also sort of recognize that when you sort of assume that for every problem or need, you just need to add a person, that can actually impede the career development and growth for your existing team, right? Because suddenly you're just adding more and more people, and you're going from being a generalist startup environment to a very specialist, like, sort of larger company environment. And I generally like to resist that temptation. And I would love for us to operate with the ethos of a startup and that entrepreneurial spirit, no matter what our size is, while also, of course, investing in the processes and structure that's required to scale. And so part of it has just been slowing down a little bit and being a bit more disciplined and choiceful about when we really believe it's not something that we can do with our existing team and resources by being creative and adapting. On the talent side, we have been hiring, and we've certainly brought in, folks that I think what I always say is, like, anyone we bring in, we want it to be unequivocally clear that they're adding to our bench strength, right? Like, they're bringing something that we just don't have internally, whether it's through their experience or skill set or relationships or something. But otherwise, my predisposition is like, let's just keep more of our focus on the team that exists today. And it's one of the things I take that from a lesson I learned at Vimeo, which is, it's like, I always notice, like, when your HR team is like putting together their plan, there's always, I always think it's so interesting because it's like you're usually only hiring, it's like 10% of your workforce, say, is new, but like 80% of the programs that you're talking about are for the new team. And so it's more about making sure, like, when we are investing in things like employee training, engagement, feedback, all of that, like, the vast majority of that attention needs to be on our existing team. And that's, I think, the phase that we're in right now, is that we're still learning and growing into how to be the best employer and to have the most empowering environment for the people that are there.
Okay, now some rapid fire.
Yeah.
What's your first, worst, and dream job?
So my first job was secretary at the time. It is sort of an executive assistant. It was for a nonprofit in Philadelphia, and I answered the phones and I filed. Like, I still remember it was like it was in college, and it was summer, and there was a room, and they asked me to go into the room, and there was like 50 boxes, and it was like, you have to reorganize all of these files, and then I think digitize them. And I like ended the summer with dozens of paper cuts. And it was just, so I think that might also have been my worst job.
I had one of those. I think I had multiple of those. Like, here, go in this room and figure out where the paper goes. Like, that's okay. After like weeks of that on end, it can really be pretty mind numbing.
Yeah. So I think actually I would have to say that was my first job. It's probably also my worst job. What was the third?
Dream job.
Dream job. Oh, so when I was a kid, I wanted to be a playwright.
Oh, what?
I
Curveball.
used to write these scripts, and I have a younger sister and brother, and we would go down to our basement, and I would like direct them, and they were like, 6 and 7 at the time, and I would make them like do the costumes, and that they'd rehearse their lines, and then we would perform it for stuffed animals, and like occasionally my mom or dad, if they had the time to watch. And to this day, I live in New York City. I love the arts. I love performing arts. I love seeing the energy on stages. So I think that's probably what I would do if I could.
Playwright kind of doubles as CEO in the making, though, too. Directing your brother and sister.
True. I was always bossy.
Who are you currently obsessed with, and why?
So first, my celebrity crush is Mindy Kaling, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
For many reasons, but I remember Kelly Kapoor, her character in The Office, was like the first time I saw an Indian woman on screen who wasn't like the nerdy, smart one with no personality. And honestly, it really impacted me. And this is also why I'm so interested in representation on screens and in storytelling, because I just think it makes such a difference for how you see yourself and I'd grown up with this like very stereotypical view of like what, an Indian immigrant, child looks like in America. And I just think that she keeps putting out amazing stories that keep breaking stereotypes. So I'm super obsessed with her. Another person who I think we've had an opportunity to work with a bit at Tubi, who I just am blown away by, is Issa Rae. And we just actually partnered with her on a new initiative to bring more independent and smaller content creators into the Hollywood ecosystem. And she's mentoring a lot of them with Tubi. And she's so fascinating because she started her career on social, like as a digital kind of creator, and then became this like very successful, sort of iconic person in Hollywood. And I just think it's, when she talks about her experience, she's super real about it. She's giving back, and she's trying to help more and more people have that kind of path. And so I'm just like really blown away by her.
She also fits the mold that you talk about, where she's having impact through her work. Like her show was so successful. So she's out there doing the work and then simultaneously, because she's grown her platform so much, having such impact.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I just like it's, and you know, it's just, and it's such an example of women who have been bold and fearless and achieved success, who are paying it forward. Yes. While continuing to strive.
Yes.
By the way.
Yeah,
right?
They both do.
Whether they fail or succeed, whether it's always perfect or not, I so appreciate that and gravitate towards that.
Speaking my language. All right. Thank you for being here.
This was great.
This was incredible. Thank you. This was really fun.
I'm so happy to do it. And I really mean it. Like you guys are, I love the brand. I love what you're doing. And I've loved watching you build your business.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Work Friends, a podcast from Argent. Listen and follow on all podcast platforms and subscribe to the Argent YouTube channel for more clips and bonus content. Plus, email your work questions and dilemmas at workfriends@argentwork.com for a chance to have one of our amazing guests weigh in with advice. I'm Sally Christensen, and we'll see you next time. Work Friends. Work Friends is produced by Gina Marinelli with editing by Justin Kropp. Our theme music is by Karina DePiano and Melanie Naima.